What happens when a millionaire's fortune collides with a mother's last breath of hope? One night, a barefoot girl in the snow set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted, a story of tears, fury, and a miracle decision that shook an entire city. Before we dive into today's emotional story, I'd love to know, where are you watching me from, and what time is it right now where you are? Snowflakes drifted under the pale glow of the hospital lights, each flake landing softly on the dark pavement before vanishing, as if the night itself was trying to hide the sorrow it carried. Ryan Thompson, a man whose name often appeared on business magazines and charity boards, stepped out of the glass doors with the same calm composure he carried in boardrooms, but the cold air bit against his skin, forcing him to pull his coat tighter. He had just concluded a charity visit, shaking hands, smiling for photos, offering promises of support, but as his polished shoes clicked against the icy ground, a sudden stillness rooted him to the spot. At the far edge of the parking lot, half shrouded by the faint fog of winter, he saw something that made his chest cave in. A little girl, no older than 8, standing alone with her bare feet pressed into the snow. Her tiny toes were red, nearly purple, and her thin dress clung to her shivering frame as if it were stitched from cold itself. She hugged a worn teddy bear so tightly it seemed the only shield she had left in a world that had already stripped her of comfort. Her lips quivered, breath showing in sharp clouds, her small shoulders shaking in a rhythm that screamed hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Ryan's heart, which had been trained to calculate risks, profits, and opportunities, now pounded for an entirely different reason. It thudded with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. Slowly, he walked closer, careful not to startle her, every step echoing against the silence of the snow-draped lot. As he approached, the child lifted her wide eyes that seemed older than her years, filled with both defiance and despair, the kind of gaze no child should ever have to wear. He lowered himself to one knee, the crisp snow soaking into his tailored trousers, yet he hardly noticed, because all he saw was the fragility in front of him. His voice softened into something almost fatherly. "Sweetheart, why are you barefoot? It's freezing." The girl clutched her bear tighter, as if to find courage in its threadbare arms, and her lashes, heavy with frozen tears, fluttered before she whispered through chattering teeth, "My shoes broke, but I can't leave. My mom's inside. They said they won't let her go unless we pay." Her words shattered something in Ryan that no financial crisis, no corporate betrayal, no boardroom battle ever could. He had heard countless stories of debt, sickness, and struggle through the lens of charity reports, but never had he heard them spoken with such raw innocence. His chest tightened painfully as if his ribs were bending beneath the weight of her truth, and his throat burned with the sting of unshed tears. He saw not just fear in those young eyes, but an unwavering love, the fierce determination of a child who refused to abandon her mother, even if it meant freezing on a cold December night. He glanced at her tiny, pale feet sinking into the snow, at her trembling hands gripping the stuffed toy until its seams stretched, and he wondered how humanity had grown so numb to suffering that a little girl had been reduced to this. The world applauded wealth, power, and prestige, yet here was a child cast out in the cold for a bill she did not even understand. Ryan felt his pulse in his ears, the question roaring silently within him. What kind of society, what kind of system, what kind of world leaves a child begging for her mother's life beneath the flicker of hospital lights? And in that moment, Ryan knew this wasn't a coincidence, this wasn't chance, it was a call, one he could not ignore, a cry for compassion that pierced the armor of his success and reminded him that true humanity wasn't measured by fortune, but by how one answered the silent pleas of the most vulnerable. Her name was Emma, just 8 years old, yet her eyes carried the weight of years that no child should ever bear, and when her lips parted the words slipped out in a whisper, fragile, trembling, as though even sound itself was too heavy for her small body to carry. "They said Mommy can't come home until we pay the bill," she confessed, her voice shrinking at the edges, as if ashamed of the truth, as if speaking it made her responsible for a burden too cruel for her tiny shoulders, and Ryan's breath caught in his throat, the bitter winter air suddenly sharper, slicing deeper, as though the world itself wanted him to feel the sting of her suffering, and she went on in halting words, clutching the bear against her chest as though it alone might shield her from the storm. I tried to save money. I sold my toys. But it's not enough. And that final phrase, that pitiful admission, cracked through Ryan's composure, like lightning striking glass, leaving shards of silence between them, and in that silence he felt rage, not at her mother, but at a world where an 8-year-old believed she had to trade away childhood in exchange for her mother's survival, and his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles ached, for this was not about balance sheets or invoices, it was about dignity, about humanity, about the raw injustice of innocence lost in the shadow of debt. He longed to ease her shivering, so he pulled off his coat, soft wool lined with warmth, and bent low, holding it out as if offering her the world, but Emma, delicate yet unyielding, shook her head with a stubbornness that shocked him, her hair falling across her chilled face as she whispered firmly, "No, keep it, I'll be fine. I just need to make sure Mommy's okay." And her refusal was not childish pride, but fierce loyalty, the kind born only from love so deep it would freeze itself to protect another. And Ryan's chest tightened again, for here was a girl who had nothing, and yet still gave everything, her tiny body trembling, yet her heart standing taller than any man he had met in all his corporate tower. And he realized in that moment how powerless his wealth looked in front of her sacrifice, how his prestige and influence seemed hollow against the raw purity of this barefoot child who demanded nothing for herself. The CEO who once signed contracts that determined livelihoods across cities now felt helpless before the sight of a little girl refusing warmth until her mother was safe. And yet inside his helplessness, something shifted. Something erupted like fire surging through ice, because her courage lit a flame in him that could not be smothered, and he knew then and there that he would not stand idle, that he could not simply walk away and let bureaucracy choke this family into despair. And though his world had always taught him to calculate gains and losses, in this moment he abandoned calculation, for his heart whispered that no ledger could ever balance the value of a child's love for her mother. Emma's small hands rubbed the arms of her teddy bear, as though coaxing life into its faded fabric, her bare toes curling against the icy ground until Ryan thought his own bones would ache for her, and he realized she had already endured too many nights like this, too many cold winds that carried the scent of antiseptic and the echo of hospital monitors, too many moments of pretending bravery while her stomach knotted with hunger and her spirit fought exhaustion. Her voice, though soft, carried a strength that startled him, a resolve that made his own carefully honed determination feel shallow in comparison, and he found himself silently asking how many more Emmas were out there, how many other children whispered their secrets into empty nights while the world hurried past, blind to the footprints they left in snow. His pulse throbbed with a strange mixture of sorrow and determination, sorrow that this child had been forced into adulthood far too soon, and determinati. On that if fate had placed her in his path tonight, then perhaps it was not accident but a test, not coincidence but calling, and the fire inside him blazed higher with every breath, igniting in his veins until his body ached with the urgency to act, to protect, to fight. Ryan, who had always been described as composed, strategic, and controlled, now felt the flood of raw, unfiltered emotion coursing through him, breaking down the walls he had built in his years of ruthless business. And in Emma's trembling figure, he saw not weakness, but a mirror of humanity's forgotten strength, a reminder that love was the most unyielding power of all. He could not fathom how the world had let her stand alone in the cold, could not fathom how policies, systems, and paper bills had reduced a child to bartering toys for life, and in that disbelief grew fury, not wild and reckless but focused, molten, sharp, a fury that would not rest until justice was done. He watched her press her cheek against the bear's matted fur, her eyes searching the hospital windows as though hoping to glimpse her mother's shadow behind the glass, and the tenderness of that gesture unraveled the last of his restraint, for he realized then that no empire, no fortune, no reputation could ever mean more than protecting the fragile hope that glimmered in her gaze. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of resolve settling into his bones, a resolve as solid as steel, and he whispered to himself, though she could not hear, that he would not allow her to carry this secret alone any longer, that he would bear it with her, that tonight he would stand between her and the cruelty of a world that had forgotten compassion. In that silent promise, Ryan Thompson, the man the press called a titan, a mogul, a giant of industry, was reduced and remade, not as a CEO, but as a man rediscovering the only title that mattered, human being. Ryan stormed into the hospital's billing office, Emma's tiny hand gripping his as though it were her only anchor in a world that kept tearing her apart, the sharp scent of disinfectant mingling with the low hum of machines from nearby rooms where lives hung in the balance, and behind the counter a stern administrator, middle-aged and expressionless, adjusted her glasses and glanced at the papers in front of her without offering even a shred of compassion, her words delivered in a cold monotone. "Sir, unless this account is settled, we can't discharge the patient. Rules are rules." A phrase that to her was procedure, but to Emma meant nights alone, fear, and the unbearable thought of losing her mother forever. And Ryan, a man accustomed to boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions, felt his composure snap as his voice thundered with a rare mix of anger and anguish. "She's a human being, not an account number." Yet before the silence of his echo faded, a small tug at his sleeve grounded him, Emma's trembling whisper slipping into his heart like a prayer. "Please don't be mad at them. Mommy says anger doesn't fix hearts." And those words pierced him more deeply than any business rival ever could, making him realize this child had been forced to carry wisdom far beyond her years, wisdom born of hardship and suffering. And suddenly, his fury dissolved into a raw ache, his chest tightening as he knelt beside her and brushed a tear from her cheek, whispering back with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed. "You're right, sweetheart. Hearts don't heal through anger, they heal through love." And turning back toward the administrator, his voice was steadier now, though no less powerful, the kind of tone that could command empires, yet was softened by the plea of a father he had never been. "I'm not asking you for favors, I'm asking you to remember this woman is someone's mother, and this little girl's entire world rests in your hands." And for the first time the administrator's eyes flickered, her professionalism cracking just slightly as she shifted uncomfortably, but she still clung to the policy book like a lifeline, repeating, "It's beyond my control, sir." And Ryan realized the true wall wasn't made of bricks or mortar but of indifference, bureaucracy, and the quiet cruelty of systems designed to measure life in dollars. And he clenched his jaw, refusing to let Emma see despair in his eyes, instead standing tall, pulling his phone from his pocket, and with a calm fury dialed his personal banker, issuing instructions to wire funds immediately. But even as he did so, Emma's tiny hand tugged again, her whisper quivering. "Mr. Ryan, please don't be sad. Mommy wouldn't want anyone to cry for her." And those words, fragile yet fierce, made him wonder how many nights this child had spent comforting her mother instead of being comforted herself. How many times she had swallowed fear to sound strong. And in that moment he vowed silently that no child, least of all Emma, should ever feel invisible in a world blinded by wealth. And as the administrator watched the transaction process with widening eyes, Ryan leaned down and pressed Emma's teddy bear closer to her chest, murmuring, "We're going to bring your mom home, I promise." And Emma, still trembling, gave a faint nod, her trust so complete it scared him, because for the first time in his life he felt the weight of a promise that wasn't about profit or contracts, but about the fragile, sacred bond between a mother and daughter. And though the hospital wall loomed large, he felt a fire inside him burn brighter than any he had known, a fire not just to pay a bill, but to tear down the very walls that left children like Emma standing barefoot in the cold, waiting for mercy that should never have been withheld in the first place. Ryan stood frozen on the other side of the glass, as Sarah's fragile silhouette came into focus, her thin frame outlined by the sterile hospital light, her lips trembling as she forced a smile for Emma, who pressed her tiny palm desperately against the cold surface, trying to bridge the barrier that kept them apart. And in that instant Ryan felt the weight of two worlds, the world of corporate triumph where he conquered numbers and contracts, and the world of quiet suffering where dignity was eroded by bills and bureaucracy. And when Sarah's weary eyes lifted and locked with his, gratitude mingled with shame in their depths, like a storm contained behind fragile glass. She mouthed words that pierced him more sharply than any accusation. "Don't. Please don't pity us." And he staggered inwardly because pity was the last thing he felt. What surged in his chest was reverence for her strength, anger at the cruelty of systems that reduced her existence to digits on a ledger, and a fierce tenderness he hadn't felt in years. Yet Sarah, pale but resolute, seemed determined to protect her pride even as exhaustion hollowed her cheeks. And Ryan realized that this wasn't simply about unpaid balances. This was about a mother gripping the last threads of her dignity while waves of hardship threatened to drown her, and Emma's small voice whispering at his side. "That's my mommy. She always smiles for me even when it hurts." Nearly broke him, because in Sarah's expression he saw both the courage to shield her child and the quiet terror of a woman who believed she must face the impossible alone. And as Ryan stood there, he silently vowed that his intervention wouldn't be charity tossed from wealth to poverty. It would be the restoration of hope, the mending of a spirit that the world had tried to fracture. And though his mind raced with the logistics of bank wires and legal clearances, his heart battled with a deeper question. How could he help without stripping away the self-respect she clung to? How could he offer rescue that felt like partnership instead of pity? And as Emma tapped the glass again, Sarah's lips curved faintly upward, though her eyes betrayed unshed tears. Ryan thought of his own mother, who had once worked double shifts to keep him clothed and fed, and he whispered in his soul that he would not allow history to crush another child's protector. But as determination surged, a shadow of doubt lingered. Would Sarah even accept his hand, or would she reject him in defiance, clinging to pride though it cost her everything? And as he placed his palm on the glass opposite Emma's, silently joining their small family in that fragile moment, Ryan understood this battle was no longer about wealth versus debt, but about healing wounds invisible to any chart, about convincing a mother who had been hardened by struggle that kindness could exist without strings. And as Sarah slowly leaned her weary head back against the pillow, closing her eyes but still holding Emma's gaze, Ryan felt the sharp ache of urgency. Time was slipping, strength was fading, and if he hesitated, he might lose the chance to show her that sometimes help was not weakness, but the bridge to survival. That night, the sterile quiet of the hospital room wrapped around Ryan like a heavy cloak as he sat across from Sarah's bed, the dim lamp casting soft shadows across her weary face, and though monitors hummed faintly in the background, all he could hear was the echo of his own heartbeat pounding with an urgency that words struggled to match. So when he finally broke the silence, his voice was low but steady, confessional in its honesty. "I know what it's like to be forgotten by the system, Sarah," he began, his eyes searching hers for permission to continue. "I grew up with nothing, hand-me-down shoes, nights when dinner was just a hope, mornings when my mother sent me to school pretending she wasn't hungry so I wouldn't know she had skipped her own meal, and every time I saw her fight silently, I promised myself that if I ever got the chance, if I ever had the power, I would never walk away from someone in need." And Sarah's eyes, though dimmed by illness, flickered with a fragile flame of recognition, as if his words had reached a hidden part of her heart. She tried to guard, and yet her voice cracked when she finally spoke, laced with disbelief and exhaustion. "Why us? Why now? You don't even know me. We're just strangers, a mother and child you happened to notice in the snow." But Ryan leaned forward, his gaze shifting to Emma curled up in the chair beside the bed, her tiny chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, her small toes still bare despite the blanket Ryan had draped earlier, and he whispered with conviction that sounded almost like prayer. "Because I can't unsee your daughter's eyes out there in the cold, clutching that bear as if it was the last shield against a world too cruel for a child. I can't forget how her voice trembled while still trying to be brave for you, and because true kindness isn't about knowing someone's past, it's about stepping into their present when no one else will." And for a long moment Sarah's lips trembled with unspoken words, her pride clashing against her desperation, her longing for relief battling with the iron wall she had built around her dignity, until finally she whispered, her voice heavy with the weight of a lifetime of struggle. "I don't want charity. I just want a chance to stand on my own 2 feet again, a chance to show my daughter that her mother isn't a burden carried by others, but a woman who fought for her future." And Ryan's chest tightened because he understood. He understood too well the pain of receiving help that felt like handouts, the sting of pity disguised as generosity, and he wanted her to know this was different, that his offer was not about debts and numbers, but about seeing her humanity, so he leaned closer, softening his tone. Then let me help you find that chance, Sarah, not by taking away your pride, but by building a bridge you can walk across with your head held high, because Emma doesn't just need her mother alive, she needs her mother strong, hopeful, unbroken." And as he spoke, he saw her eyes glisten, the dam of restraint threatening to break, yet still she hesitated, the question lingering in her silence. What would his help cost? What would it mean to accept a gift from a man like him? And Ryan, sensing her unspoken fears, added gently, "I don't want anything in return, except to see Emma smile without fear and to see you breathe without the weight of this debt crushing you." And in that moment, the room felt suspended, the hospital walls no longer suffocating but trembling with the fragile possibility of new beginnings. Yet the decision lay in Sarah's hands, and Ryan knew that no matter how much wealth he commanded, he could not force trust, he could only offer it, like a seed waiting for her courage to let it take root. Ryan had believed, perhaps naively, that writing a check would be enough, that with one stroke of his pen he could erase the crushing weight hanging over Sarah and Emma. But when he returned to the hospital office with determination blazing in his chest, the faces of the board members seated stiffly behind polished mahogany told him the truth before their words even landed, and the sternest among them slid a folder across the desk with practiced detachment, as she declared, "Mr. Thompson, this case has been flagged, coverage was denied by the insurance company, and even if you clear the outstanding balance today, the account is still entangled in legal escalation, which means the family faces not only continued collections, but the risk of custody review due to financial instability." And Ryan's ears rang as the words struck like hammers, his fists curling against the urge to shatter the veneer of bureaucracy they clung to, and with fury igniting in his voice he thundered, "You're telling me this mother, who lies in that bed fighting for her life, might lose her child because of numbers on a spreadsheet? Because she couldn't navigate your cold system fast enough?" But the board, trained in deflection, shifted uncomfortably while the chairwoman replied flatly, "Our responsibility is to policy, not sentiment, sir." And Ryan's pulse surged. Ged, his mind racing with images of Emma's trembling body in the snow, of Sarah's eyes begging silently not to be pitied but to be seen, and he realized with gut-deep horror that this was not an isolated tragedy but a machine designed to grind down the vulnerable, one family after another sacrificed at the altar of profit. And though part of him burned to slam his fortune down on the desk and demand they reverse their decision, another part whispered that money alone could not untangle this web, because behind Sarah's case stood thousands of silent voices, families scattered across the city carrying invisible scars from debts that turned homes into prisons. And as he turned from the boardroom, his chest heaving with a mixture of rage and clarity, Ryan understood that his role in this story had shifted, that he could not simply be a benefactor patching one wound, he had to become a force tearing down the walls that created the wound in the first place. Yet the enormity of it pressed against him like a mountain, for he was only one man, even if he was a millionaire CEO, and as he strode back through the sterile halls, every step echoed with Emma's soft whisper from earlier, "Mommy says anger doesn't fix hearts." And he clutched that truth, forcing himself to mold his fury into resolve, because anger alone would destroy him, but purpose could build something new. And when he returned to Sarah's room, her fragile body silhouetted by the dim light, and Emma curled protectively by her side, Ryan knew he couldn't tell them yet of the obstacles ahead, not when hope had only just begun to flicker in their darkness. So he stood silently in the doorway, vowing to himself that no matter how many signatures, policies, or courtroom threats he had to fight, he would not allow Emma's childhood to be stolen or Sarah's dignity to be dismantled. And though the board believed they had shut the door, Ryan Thompson's fire had only been lit, and walking away was no longer an option, it was war. The following morning, as dawn broke and the hospital grounds buzzed with their usual quiet shuffle, Ryan stepped onto the wide stone steps outside the main entrance, his tailored coat pulled tight against the winter air, but his face carrying an intensity that no cold could dim, and before him stood a sea of cameras, microphones, and curious bystanders, reporters shouting his name, flashes lighting his determined expression. Yet his voice, when it rose above the commotion, was steady, commanding, filled with a conviction that silenced the chaos around him. "No family in this city will ever face homelessness or custody loss over hospital debt again," he declared, each syllable striking like a hammer against the walls of indifference, and as gasps rippled through the crowd, he pressed forward. "Starting today, I am not only wiping out the bills that chained Sarah and her daughter Emma to despair, but I am launching a permanent fund to ensure no child in this community suffers what Emma has endured. No mother is forced to choose between treatment and dignity, and no family is broken apart because of paperwork and unpaid balances." And the frenzy that followed was electric. Cameras flashing like lightning, reporters clamoring for details, voices rising in disbelief that a corporate titan would shoulder such a burden. But Ryan's gaze never faltered, his jaw tight with purpose, because this wasn't about headlines, it was about rewriting the story for thousands of invisible families. And inside the hospital room, Sarah sat trembling, Emma's small arms wrapped tightly around her waist, tears streaming freely down her cheeks as she watched the televised broadcast on the flickering screen mounted to the wall, her heart hammering with a mixture of disbelief and release. And when Ryan finally returned, shoulders heavy from the weight of the decision but eyes softened by resolve, Sarah reached out with shaking hands, clutching his sleeve as if grounding herself in the reality of his presence, her voice breaking into sobs as she whispered, "Why would you do this, Ryan? You don't owe us anything." And Ryan, standing tall yet bending low enough to meet her gaze without distance, allowed a gentle smile to spread across his face, his eyes shimmering with memories he rarely shared, and he answered with a softness that carried the echo of his own childhood. "Because once, when I was a boy with nothing, someone stepped into my life and gave me a chance when the world had written me off, and I swore that if I ever rose high enough I would spend my life paying it forward. So tonight, this isn't just about you and Emma. This is about every forgotten voice, every child shivering in silence, every parent breaking under a weight they should never have had to carry." And as Sarah broke down fully, clutching Emma tighter, the room filled with a sacred kind of silence, not the sterile quiet of machines, but the holy stillness of hope reborn. And Ryan knew in that instant that though battles with bureaucracy would rage on, though critics would question and systems would resist, a miracle decision had been made. Not by a CEO with wealth, but by a man who had chosen to turn his scars into bridges for others to cross. And in that moment, the story shifted from private pain to public promise, a promise that no matter how dark the night, there would always be a hand reaching through the glass to pull another soul back into the light. Weeks later, the gray winter skies had softened into pale sunlight, and the sharp winds that once bit through Emma's bare feet had turned into gentle breezes carrying the scent of new beginnings. And on that morning, Sarah walked slowly but freely through the hospital doors, her thin frame steadied by her daughter's small hand gripping hers with a mixture of pride and protectiveness, her steps not rushed but deliberate as, if each one reclaimed a piece of the dignity that had nearly been stolen from her, and though her body still carried the marks of illness, her spirit radiated a quiet strength that no debt collector could ever extinguish. While Emma skipped at her side, her curls bouncing as she proudly wore her new shoes, shiny pink ones Ryan had placed carefully at her feet weeks before, shoes that were more than fabric and rubber, they were symbols of care, proof that she would never again be left to shiver in the snow without protection. And as the hospital doors shut behind them, Sarah paused, her chest heaving with tears that were not of sorrow but of relief, because the true gift was never just the money Ryan had given, not even the fund that bore Emma's story in its mission. It was the return of safety, the gift of breathing without fear of eviction, of waking without the crushing panic of overdue bills, of holding her daughter without wondering if someone would come to take her away. It was dignity restored, hope reborn, and she turned to Ryan, who stood a few steps away, hands in his coat pockets, eyes softened not by triumph but by humility, and with tears streaming freely down her cheeks she whispered, "You didn't just save us, Ryan. You showed us that humanity still exists, that kindness isn't dead in a world obsessed with numbers and power." And Ryan, moved beyond words, crouched down so his eyes met Emma's, his face gentle but earnest as he spoke the lesson that had burned into his soul since that frozen night. "And you reminded me, Emma, that even a barefoot child, standing in the snow with nothing but courage and love for her mother, can teach a millionaire what really matters." And Emma, her lips curling into a shy smile, leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, a hug so pure it melted years of hidden loneliness inside him. And Sarah, watching through blurred vision, realized that this man who had once been a stranger had become part of their story forever, not as a savior to worship, but as a reminder that sometimes the world's coldest nights lead us to its warmest hearts. And as days turned to weeks and weeks to spring, the last patches of snow melted into streams along the sidewalks. The trees stretched out new green leaves, and children's laughter filled the parks again. But for Ryan, Sarah, and Emma, the memory of that one cold night remained etched like scripture, a constant reminder of the fragile line between despair and hope, and proof that one act of kindness, one decision to stop and see another's pain instead of walking past, can ripple outward, changing not only a family, but the course of a community, even the course of a life. And as Sarah lifted her face to the sun, Emma twirling beside her, Ryan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a breath that carried both closure and beginning, for in their survival he had rediscovered his own humanity, and together they stepped forward into a world where compassion had reclaimed its rightful place, and the story of a barefoot child and a millionaire would live on, not as tragedy, but as a testament to the power of care, dignity, and love.